in the moonlight, meet us boys have been around. Show the girls a little good time, spinning tires on the soft ground. Crop circles round a campfire, we're gonna smolder a little grass. But watch out, Farmer Johnson's got salt shot to pepper you. Farmer Johnson's got a shotgun, running naked through a cornfield. Something came in the middle of the night, stole moonshine from his tail. There's burn marks in a circle, strange signs upon the ground. He thinks the aliens have touched down in our little town. We know. Crop circles in the moonlight, meet us boys have been around. Show the girls a little good time, spinning tires in the soft ground. Crop circles round a campfire, we're gonna smolder a little grass. But watch out, crazy Johnson's got salt shot to pepper you. Johnson took his hat off, open mic at the town hall. Said we're visitors sitting among us from somewhere beyond the stars. You don't know them cause they like trouble, they drink our beer, they like fun. I even seen them with the mayor's daughter, driving around in a local boy's truck. All but you know. Crop circles in the moonlight, meet us boys have been around. Show the girls a little good time, spinning tires in the soft ground. Crop circles round a campfire, we're gonna smolder a little grass. But watch out, crazy Johnson's got salt shot to pepper you. He says they're gonna beam us up, take us in our trucks. They're gonna beam us up, experiment on us. They're gonna beam us up, take us in our trucks. They're gonna beam us up, experiment on us. Crop circles in the moonlight, meet us boys have been around. Show your girls a little good time, spinning tires in the soft ground. Crop circles round a campfire, we're gonna smolder a little grass. But watch out, crazy Johnson's got salt shot to pepper you. Yeah, girls, we're gonna beam you up, take you in our trucks. Beam you up, experiment on love. We're gonna beam you up, take you in our trucks. We're gonna beam you up, experiment on love. Beam us up, take us in our trucks. Beam us up, experiment on love. Beam us up, take us in our trucks. Beam us up, experiment on love.
Hello, Rockanites. This is Gary Wheeler, your host for the next hour, and you have tuned in to the show High Strangeness. This is a place where everything is believed unless it's proved otherwise. So our topics are always mainly around ufology, UFOs, and those others who many of us feel are visiting and have been visiting us. The theme today was from the album by Brady called Crop Circles. Interestingly, a country western singer talking about UFOs and crop circles. Of course, there was the truck and the woman and the shotgun and the dog and what's all that's all necessary for a country western song, but it's pretty good. And there's a whole album. I haven't heard the rest of the album, but suggest you might want to listen to it. So it's kind of encouraging that such music is out there and coming out. I'd like to give a shout out to my daughter Laura in Boston, if she's managed to listen today. Hi, Laura. Beautiful day here in Rockland. I hope it's the same in other places, including Boston and the local mid-coast area. We're doing all kinds of stuff is going on in town here. But before I get into that, I'll mention that today, as usual, callers are welcome. Interested in people who have questions about UFOs and the others, and maybe have an experience or know of somebody who has. And the number to call here is 207-593-0013. That's 593-0013. And you can remain anonymous, but you should know you'll be on air as soon as you answer the phone or as soon as I come on. So you'll know that. Also, another way to ask a question is to text me on my cell phone. That number is 207-691-3110. I'd be interested, especially, there was an event in Rockland this last week where there was a video taken of some identified objects in the sky that appeared on my Facebook page anyway. And some people were talking about it, and if anybody had shared that experience, or the person who actually took the video would give me a call, I'd appreciate it, and we could discuss a little more about what that event was like. But from the picture, I couldn't exactly tell what had been seen, but it was evident from what the person said in the video that they saw something, and it kind of flabbergasted them a bit. Enough to say a couple expletives about what are those objects. So that's kind of interesting right here in little old Rockland. So you never know. You just keep looking up occasionally and you might get really surprised. Also, I had an interesting guest at the house this last week who is from San Diego and is an ex-pilot, and he does some interviewing for the San Diego Aeronautics Museum, and he interviews pilots about their experience flying, especially flying experimental and bizarre aircraft. And we got talking a little bit about the whole show here and the UFO thing, and he got very interested, although he's definitely a skeptic, but is one who's sort of open to a dialogue about it, which is always helpful. And of course, my eyes light up when somebody says they're receptive. So anyway, he decided he would like to interview me and put it on his channel, which is on YouTube. And the channel he has is through the Aeronautics Museum. So I'll be interested to see if the museum puts it on about UFOs. So it'll be interesting. It's a very conservative area out there, whether they're open to this idea or they're part of the whole media stuff that doesn't want to hear about all this stuff. It wants to keep their heads buried in the sand when it comes to UFOs. So I'll let you know. I'll put whatever interview comes up, I'll put it on my archives for this show. So you'll have access to it. I'm interested. It was a good interview. Sometimes I amaze myself at how much information I've stuffed into this head of mine around UFOs, but I always find it exciting to do such things. Again, keep in mind that this is picture taking time. Look at your photographs. Look at the sky in your photographs. Your camera can pick up some subtle frequencies that our eyes don't pick up. and things appear in your photos you don't see when you take the picture. And just like in Rockland, those things might appear to be a UFO, or certainly something of interest. Also, crop circles are back because the crops are back, especially in England, around Stonehenge area. There's always crop circles when there's crops. So they've begun this year. There's 2 or 3 new ones. I suggest you go to the webpage by Lucy Pringle. It's LucyPringle.co.uk. She's a photographer and has recorded all the crop circles, especially more recently, although her website is marvelous because it archives all the older pictures she's taken over the years. So it's a very good resource for research around crop circles. Crop circles, of course, are the sleeping giant when it comes to the skeptics around UFOs. Nobody wants to try to explain how crop circles are really made when it's can be proven that humans couldn't do it. So that's always, I find, is a conversation stopper when somebody's being skeptical about the possibility of extraterrestrial beings being in contact with us. So try to take note of those crop circles. There's definitely powerful stuff happening in those messages that are in those geometric shapes. Again, I'll remind you, you're listening to the show High Strangeness at WRFR 93.3 FM in Rockland and 99.3 in Camden. This afternoon, this show is brought to you, as usual, by Diverse Landscapes here in Rockland, and also by Eric Best, who is an author, a business consultant, and a good friend of mine. Thank you to you both for supporting or giving us what's necessary to keep the show going. I do appreciate that. Also, let's see, today's show, we're going to basically continue what I had started last week, was an interview. We're in actually it's a conversation by George KNAPP, presentation he gave in Denmark at an Exopolitics conference back in 2010, I believe, and the conference is about the UFOs and the media, and specifically how the media manipulates information so it doesn't look credible. Also about Bob Lazar and Area 51, both of which are extremely interesting areas, and individual Bob Lazar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue that today, and actually we'll finish it today, and I'll talk more as we go on here. So that's it for the news so far in Rockland, and I'll turn you over now to George KNAPP.
I was thrilled with some of this stuff that President Clinton spoke publicly about Area 51. President Obama spoke about it. He did that, by the way, if you'll recall, while he was honoring Shirley MacLaine, which seemed kind of somehow fitting. But I was a little bit worried when I saw the Kardashians heading to Area 51. In the TV business, there's a phrase known as jumping the shark. When a show has gone too far to be credible anymore, that's what we call it, jumping the shark. And I don't know if the Kardashians may have jumped the shark from the first stop, but when they started going to Area 51, I thought, this has gone too far. You saw at the end of that video clip this original footage of a saucer test flight that LAZAAR and Gene Huff and John Lear and others had witnessed, not once, not twice, but 3 weeks in a row. LAZAAR knew when these test flights would take place. He knew where they would take place. There had been no news stories about it, no coverage anywhere officially. And to this day, the story is there is nothing at Papoose Lake. There has never been a facility there, even though satellite photos show a road that goes down there. And there's no base, there's no facility, there's nothing but a dry lake bed at Papoose. So how did Bob know? How did he know this stuff? It's one of the points we're going to come back to. Play this next little clip of this a little bit better look at that saucer. That's a freeze frame. There's some enhancement that was done. That's the object. It was flying above Papoose Lake. And I don't know, it looks like a flying saucer to me. Over the years, dozens of people have captured their own images of things flying around out there. There's a classic sombrero-shaped UFO that was flying around out there, weird lights. Now, some of these things, like everything else, they're misidentifications. They're military planes, secret aircraft, secret platforms of one sort or another. But a heck of a lot of them look like flying saucers. And if we've been flying them out there since the 1950s, which is how long people have been seeing them, if it's a classified project, when do we get a look? When did they declassify it? When did they roll it out of the hangar? Last year, I don't know if you read this story here, if it got much publicity, but the CIA formally announced last year that Area 51 exists. Whoop-de-freakin'-do. You know, Area 51 exists. We've known that it exists. We've got satellite photos. We know people who worked out there. The world has yeah, I can stop it. The world has known about it for a long time. So CIA goes public with this announcement. I'm wondering, what are they up to? Well, they wanted to use it as an explanation to brush away all reports of UFOs. Don't worry. I think what the words were, remember all those UFOs you were seeing in the 50s and 60s? That was us. Ha, ha, ha. I don't even, and you know, at the same time they acknowledged that the base was real, they did something else sneaky. They said the real reason that these rumors about flying saucers at Area 51 had been started is because people outside the base were seeing weird things flying around and they mistook them for UFOs. Well, you know, and they're implying that these are U-2s and SR-71 and stealth technology. It's similar to the earlier CIA release that was done a couple of years ago to explain away all UFO sightings. That's all us, they said. It's the agency, it's our secret planes. And they made a campaign about it on Twitter. Well, bullshit. It's bullshit. I don't even know where to start with that. The U-2 is a great big gangly plane that has big long wings. It doesn't look like a flying saucer. It doesn't hover silently. It doesn't fly up and down like this. It doesn't land in people's cornfields or backyards. It was designed to not be seen at all. Same for the SR-71, the A-12, the stealth technology. Those are not flying saucers. And this suggests that people are seeing those planes, and that's the cause of the stories at Area 51 is ridiculous. More importantly, the stories about flying saucers in Nevada didn't start because there were people outside the base seeing things flying around. They started because people inside the base started leaking the information. And one of those people was Bob LAZAAR. I'm not going to try to convince you beyond any doubt that LAZAAR is telling the truth. For most people, you know, that horse has left the barn. You've already made up your mind about it. Chances are, if you're here to hear some of this, you probably give him at least some credibility. You know, that legend is galloping around down the road and around the world, and most people have made up their minds, as I said. I will give you two thoughts on this, though. One is that my belief, it's a moot point anyway, as Robbie Graham was saying, because this Area 51 story is now permanently etched into the public consciousness, whether anybody likes it or not. It's taken on a life of its own, independent of Bob LAZAAR. LAZAAR, by the way, did not work at Area 51, although a lot of people say that. He was at S4, and we've already made that distinction. Earlier this year, there was a tour. They now take tours out to Area 51, regular tours. If you, as a tourist, you want to go to Las Vegas and take a drive out there, they'll put you in a vehicle, take you right up to the edge of Area 51. You can take a couple of snapshots, and you go back home. Earlier this year, I aired a story about a tour group. They had their driver, who was relatively new to the job, and they're yakking at him as he's driving up to the gate. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. He blows right through this sign, the warning sign that says, "Stop or you will be shot." He blows right through it. And they're driving along and they're wondering, hey, where's that base? You know, where's the camo dude? Shouldn't we be stopping here? And all of a sudden, bam, he's right on their butt. Pulled them over, pulled out guns, threatened to arrest them. They wrote him up big citations. The guy is never allowed to go back. So other drivers will have to go there. But it was a big mess, and I helped negotiate the fine down so these people didn't have to dig into their pockets too bad. But as the video from that camera showed, this driver is telling his own reality about Area 51. Oh, yeah, The mothership is often out there hovering over the base, and there's secret underground facilities where the aliens, they mix up vats of human and alien parts and to create these hybrids. I mean, total nonsense, totally made up. But there's the guy who's official tour guide for Area 51 making this stuff up. And it sort of goes to the point that it's taken on a life of its own, and we couldn't stop it if we wanted to. The second thing I wanted to convey is how we pursued this story as journalists. I did not go into this as a lark. It wasn't a joke. I approached it as a story, and I knew there were great risks involved in this because of our credibility. Our credibility of the whole station was on the line. If we screwed this up and promoted this guy as some UFO messiah, and it blew up in our face, we might not ever recover. The station's credibility was on the line, and I know it looks preposterous from the get-go, and that many of our competitors wished it was preposterous, but that's not how it's turned out. My friend and colleague Stan Friedman has been outspoken about Area 51 and Bob Lazar. He thinks it's possible. He buys the idea there could be flying saucers out there, but he doesn't buy Lazar, and he's been way out in front. I have to give Stan credit for doing some of the legwork. Unlike a lot of Bob's critics, Stan has gone to MIT and Caltech and looked for Bob Lazar's educational credentials, and he found them lacking. And I applaud him for that. But because that part of Bob's story is weak, Stan has written the whole thing off, which is what a lot of people have done. I don't know how to I've tried to remind Stan about this in person, and I've said it in public a few times, but the important thing is with Lazar is that the information about his educational background was in the very first story that we aired. The very first report that identified him, we said we could not verify his background. And I will confide to you this. I don't believe he ever went to those schools. I don't believe Bob Lazar could get a degree from Caltech or MIT for a very simple reason. At American universities, when you get a degree, an undergraduate degree, you have to take all kinds of core courses in subjects that you may not be interested in. Literature. I cannot possibly imagine, and Anna, you know Bob, I can't imagine Bob Lazar sitting through a class in American Lit or reading poetry or something like that. He'd never stand for it. There is no way in hell that he sat through that stuff to get a degree. So what do we do? What do we do with that? Do we throw out the story? Here's how I rationalize it, is Bob would not be the first person to lie about his educational credentials in order to get a good job. As his friend of a long time, I've given him the opportunity. Bob, look, come clean on this. Let me know about, if it's a lie, come clean on it. Get it behind you. And he's never given me that satisfaction of saying, yeah, it's a lie. He maintains the story. I don't know what the true story is, whether they could make his records disappear. I have found people who said he was at Caltech, who said that they remember him being on the campus, but that's not enough to make the point. As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter. I don't care whether Bob Lazar went to Caltech. The fact that he would lie about it is problematic, but I don't think it's a reason to toss out the entire story, because people do lie about their background in order to get a great job. The thing with Bob is he is an interesting guy. I know a lot of people think that he's a fraud, that he never worked out there. For me, the key was always, did he work at Los Alamos National Lab? Because it seemed to me that if he had worked at Los Alamos in a scientific capability on classified projects, then it's conceivable that he would have got hired to work at someplace else in the Nevada desert. So we went to Los Alamos. I went there a couple of times. I started writing letters to them to see if Bob had ever worked there, and they said, no, we have no records of him whatsoever. And then I found a headline in the Los Alamos newspaper that says, there's Bob Lazar as a physicist. What about that? Nope, we don't have him. He never worked here. Then I found a phone book from the lab that lists his name and number. There he is. Well, we still can't find any records on him. So I wrote to a company, Kirkmeyer. It's a headhunter company. It hires people for the lab and fills positions in scientific and technical jobs. They had hired Bob. I called him up. I said, yeah, did you hire him? Do you have records? Yeah, we've got the records on him. We hired him. We got him the job at Los Alamos. Great. Can I get a copy of those? No problem. That went on for 2.5 years, where they first said that they would give me the records. Then they delayed it. Then they stopped taking my calls altogether. And then they said, quit bothering us. Someone got to him. I mean, they had them, and then they didn't have them. But I became convinced for other reasons that Bob was there. I talked to people he worked with who said he was there, and he worked in classified positions, on classified stuff. I went to Los Alamos, and Bob LAZAAR took us in. It was on a Sunday, and we had a camera rolling on it. He took us into the gate, waves at the guy at the front. They let him on in, let us in, and then he took us into Los Alamos, and it was like a rabbit in his own burrow, taking us through these buildings, obscure places, waving to people along the way, gave us a little tour, all of it recorded on video. How did he know? You know, it's the same thing with the flying saucer test. You don't believe that Bob worked at S4 or Area 51? How did he know about the test? There had been no newspaper stories about it. He knew when and where it would take place, and the video captured it. I interviewed all the people that went with him on those trips, and they all verified the story just as he told it. How did he know? Here's some other stuff that he knew. There was an agency called OFI. Bob thought it was the FBI. I said, who did your background check, you know, when you were getting your security clearance? I think it was the FBI. It was a guy named Mike Thigpen. I called the FBI up. They said, we don't have any Mike Thigpen. We don't do background tests. Come to find out what it was is there was an agency called the OFI, Office of Federal Investigation. I had never heard about it before, but sure enough, turns out that's the agency that does background checks for people who work at the Nevada test site. And although Area 51 is not part of the Nevada test site officially, it's attached to it, and they do that work. And sure enough, they have an agent named Mike Thigpen. How did he know? How did Bob know that a guy named Mike Thigpen worked for an agency that I had never even heard of before? Those facts were confirmed. It's weird stuff that happened during that time period. It's hard to convey to an audience sitting in a room like this, but it was a strange time to live through. Break-ins at Bob's house. They would break into his house, leave all the doors and windows open, and write stuff on his blackboard or move things around. There was a time when he and a friend, he was getting really nervous because strange things were happening in his life. They go to a gym to work out, and Bob started carrying a gun. Somebody had taken a shot at him. He had this gun in the glove box, locks the car, goes into the gym, comes back out an hour and a half later. The cars to the door are open, the windows are rolled down, the glove box is open, the gun is laying there on the seat. It's like somebody wanted him to know he was under surveillance. He would call me in the middle of the night, and I'd go over to his house, rushing over there, and he's peeking out the window, and I know this will make him sound paranoid, peeking out the window holding an Uzi, because he thought people were messing with him. They were messing with him. I mean, they threatened to kill him. They threatened to make him disappear. They were following us around everywhere we went, into bars, to work. I had a series of phone calls at the station. This really ticks me off. People who called up offering to give me additional information about Area 51. And I'll get into some of those specifics in a minute. 6 people who had called to offer me additional information and said, yeah, agreed to be interviewed, were visited one right after another. There was a guy who was a tax preparer. His name was Roy Byram. He did tax returns for officers at Nellis Air Force Base, and he got to know him pretty well. And they were on an out-of-town trip when they were sitting around drinking some beers, and these guys told them about Area 51, flying saucers, S4, the whole story as told by Bob. He agrees to tell me that story on the phone. The very next day, he gets visited. These 2 guys who said they're from the Secret Service, they said, we hear you've been issuing threats against the life of the president, and we can tell you that if you're talking to the wrong people and saying the wrong things, you can go to prison. Well, he saw that as a threat because of him talking to me. There was a lady who works in the Clark County court system. She had been a stenographer for a company called Holmes and Narber. It's a defense contractor. She sat in on meetings at which she took dictation. Air Force guys, CIA, and her boss, these contractors, when they talked about Roswell and the Roswell wreckage, and some of that material go into Area 51. She said after the meeting, they would not only take all her notes, they would take the ribbon out of the typewriter so that nobody could reconstruct what she had written. And so she told this story to a cop, a police officer who I know, and he offered to make an introduction. So I called this lady up. I said, let's get together. I'll hide your identity. Don't worry, I won't get you in trouble. She agreed to tell me this story. Very next day, she gets a knock on the door, and these 2 guys show up. They said, we're from Holmes and Narber. You do know that you're still under a security clearance. You're still under security restrictions. You can't talk to anybody. She goes, what are you talking about? They go, we know that you and your daughter lives in LA, you live in Las Vegas, and the 2 of you travel back and forth a lot. You know, there's a lot of desert out there. Something bad could happen if you were to say the wrong thing. They were threatening her daughter's life. She was scared to death. I tried to get a hold of her 10 years and then 20 years after that our first conversation. She still wouldn't talk to me. She was scared. I had a guy who was an electrical engineer who had worked at KLAS TV. And he, before working there, he had been at Area 51. And he said he walked into a big hangar, and there under a tarp was something that looked like a flying saucer. Well, he was living in Seattle at the time that he told me this story. And so I contacted him. I said, look, we're working on a series about UFOs. Would you give me an interview? Would you do this on camera? I'll black out your face. He goes, yeah, sure. Next morning, I mean, the very next day, there's two guys sitting in a car, clean military haircuts, talking into a radio, sitting out in front of his house. And they followed him to work. And then when he got out of work, they're sitting there and talking on the radio, and they followed him home. He was scared. He knew they were trying to intimidate him, and he wouldn't talk to me. What that told me, 6 people in a row, boom, 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 same thing, is that they were listening to my phone. And that really ticked me off, that they would monitor, back there before we had the NSA listening to everybody's phones, that they were listening to my phone. And it really ticked me off. But it was real. I had so many people. If this story was just about Bob Lazar, we would never have done it. But I had more than 24 people who had worked at Area 51, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, who told me bits and pieces of the same story. I had the guy who was a golf pro at Nellis Air Force Base who knew all these high-ranking officers who told me the same story about Roswell wreckage going to Area 51 and saucers being tested. And he told me that story. He's another one who got a visit. There was a guy who, his name is Glenn Pace, and back in the days of above-ground nuclear testing in Nevada, the most nuked place in the world, it was his job as a spotter. He was one of the only people on the Nevada test site that was allowed to use binoculars. So he'd be out there when they would be planning these atomic tests. He'd be in a building, sometimes for days at a time, waiting for the test to take place. And he had these binoculars. He was at a place called Area 15, which looks right over into Area 51. And he said they used to watch these, what looked like flying saucers over Papoose Dry Lake all the time. His boss was a German physicist, one of the Nazi scientists who came over under Operation Paperclip named Otto Kraus, who told him about alien technology being tested out there. I had a guy named Howard Cannon. He was a United States Senator from Nevada. He was the man who practically built Area 51 because he would get all the secret appropriations, the money that went into building it. He was like the father of Nellis Air Force Base. He's a retired brigadier general from the Air Force, a decorated war hero. He was very good friends with the men who built Area 51, the guys from the Skunk Works, Lockheed. When Howard Cannon lost his last election, they gave him, as a going-away present, the ability to fly in the SR-71. There's only 30 people in the world, or 40 people in the world that have ever been in one, and he got to fly in it. That's how close he was to these guys. Howard's son, Alan, is a friend of ours, had had these conversations with his dad about UFOs. Howard had never, the senator had never spoken about it publicly, but he finally agreed through his son to tell me the story about Area 51. And I went over and interviewed him, the last interview before he died, and he came this close to spilling it all. His best friend in the Senate was Barry Goldwater. I don't know if you remember that name, but Goldwater had run for president. Goldwater had tried to get into Wright-Patterson, the stories about the Blue Room. And he'd been told, no, you can't get in and you can't ask about it, never ask again. Well, Howard Cannon had the same experience. He told me that story before he died. He went right up to the edge of saying there's flying saucers at Area 51. And then he said this, what would be the point of telling that? They would deny it. They'd call it a lie. You're never going to get to see that technology. They're never going to let it out. So what would be the point? Howard Cannon is a man that I believe. One other source I'll tell you about, and then we'll move on.
I'm going to interrupt there for a second and relate a couple factual information here. This is WRFR 93.3 in Rockland and 99.3 in Camden. You're listening to Gary Wheeler's show. The show is High Strangeness. The number here, if you wish to call in, is 207-593-0013. You can send me a text message at 691-3110. If you have questions, feel free to either call or text. We're listening to the basically the end of a speech by George KNAPP in Denmark, talking about Area 51 and Bob LAZAAR and the relationship with the media, the cover-ups, and the people that have come forward and how they've been treated. And you can understand, if you listen, why people are paranoid because of the threats that come to keep their mouth shut about anything that have to do with UFOs. Okay, I'm going to go back to it now.
It's a guy whose name I can't give you, but there was a book by a lady named Annie Jacobson about Area 51, and it's a tremendous book about the history of all those secret planes. Annie Jacobson, at the end of her book, though, has a capper where she says she talked to this old guy who said that there were flying saucers out there, but they're not alien flying saucers. They'd been built by the Nazis, captured by the Russians, and that what crashed at Roswell was one of these Russian Nazi technology that the aliens were not aliens. They were refugees from a concentration camp who just looked like aliens. It's a ridiculous story, but I knew immediately that the source of it was a guy that I had stalked. I stalked him literally for 3 years because I knew he was in a position to know. He had worked at Area 51 in a management capacity, and finally I got him to open up. He invited me to his house. He said, "You want to talk about atomic bombs and testing?" And he's going through his scrapbooks, and I'm looking at these pictures of bombs and everything, and he stops, closes the book, he goes, "That's not what you're here to talk about, is it?" I said, "No, not really." So I know what you're here for. And then he started telling me a story about saucers, aliens. This is a guy he's not Bob LAZAAR. His credentials are not questionable. He was in the position to know, and he laid the story out for me. Somewhere along the line, though, he changed it. And by the time Annie Jacobson got a hold of him, it was not aliens, which, by the way, he told me that the alien looked like Ross Perot, who was a billionaire businessman, a little skinny guy with great big ears. Anyway, along the way, there are some very real people who had told me bits and pieces of the story. It's not just Bob. Let's play one of them. This guy named Jim Goodall wrote books about stealth technology. He was a friend of John Lear.
Did you ever get any information about a facility at Papoose, like the one you described?
I have a friend of mine. He's a retired senior master sergeant. He was early on in the F-117 program, and they had their badge, restricted area badge. He can go anywhere in the Nevada test site, up to and including Area 51. So they had a Humvee. And they drove around was it Groom Range? Yeah, Groom Range. And they're on Papoose Lake. There isn't anybody around, and all of a sudden, they're surrounded by guys in black uniforms, with their hands on their weapons, wanting to know who they were, what are you doing here? And my buddy said, we have some downtime, we're just exploring the area. He said, you turn around and you leave and don't come back.
They just kind of popped up out of nowhere?
He doesn't know where they came from. He didn't see any vehicles. All of a sudden, they were there. And he left. There was 3 or 4 guys with him. They left.
What do you make of that? That there might be something at Papoose, or was, or?
Well, according to Bob, that's where the 9 hangarettes are, camouflaged in the side of the mountain.
I'll give you one other thing about S4 and Papoose. There was a guy named Jerry Freeman. He's an archaeologist. And you wouldn't think an archaeologist has anything to do with flying saucers. Jerry Freeman was studying the path of the 49ers. There was a gold rush of 1849 when thousands of people fled west to try to strike it rich. And a lot of them in covered wagons and settlers, and they had certain paths that they followed, and Jerry Freeman was trying to reconstruct the path that the 49ers had taken, and he thought that they had gone right straight across the Nevada test site, and in fact had been at Papoose Lake. So what he did was, very bold of him, he infiltrated the test site from going west to east and walked all the way across it, dodged security patrols. He would walk in the nighttime and then hide during the day, and he made it all the way across. Let's show the Freeman stuff. He made it all the way across the test site to Papoose Lake. These are pictures that he had set up with an automatic camera. That's Papoose behind him. That's the place where Bob Lazar said he worked. So Freeman, again, walking at night and hiding in the day, gets all the way to Papoose. He finds the evidence he's looking for. The 49ers had carved something into the rocks there. But as he's sitting out there at night, right at Papoose, it's a sad story, by the way, he died, a doorway opens up. He said he's sitting there and a doorway of light opens up in the middle of the sky, and things come out, people come out, objects come out, and then it closed up again. Now, he's not a flying saucer guy. He walked all the way across the test site, not realizing that land is still contaminated with all kinds of nuclear fallout. And he died of cancer 2 years after his journey. But anyway, he gave a little piece that sort of goes along with what Jim Goodall just said about people coming out of nowhere. Remember, Papoose Lake, where Lazar said there's this facility built in the side of the mountain, there is nothing there officially. The last piece of information is a UFO guy named James Wildermuth. I never knew of the guy before. He's a European guy here, and he sent me these images that he found on Google Earth. Normally this would have been cleaned up, but somehow he found it. You tell me what it looks like. Anyway, he used Google Earth to take a good hard look at this, and he found some lines on the side of Papoose that looked like exactly what Lazar had been describing. He put the pins in there, but you can see the thin outline of these lines. 9 of them, 9 containers. A friend of mine was an investigator for Congress, and he had the highest security clearances. He thought that something was really going on at Area 51. I gave him a briefing, and he made them let him in. They flew him in a blinding snowstorm to S4 in Papoose, but they took him to the other side of the facility. He got out and looked around. His name was Dick D'Amato. He worked for a senator who oversaw the budget, and looked around out there, and he said this was 5 years after Bob Lazar's story came forward, and he said there was nothing there. But he didn't look in this side. And it sure looked like hangar doors to me, or at least some lines that indicated that something could be there. That's good. I want to give you a couple of pieces of what Lazar says now, because his views on things have changed quite a bit, as you might imagine. So many crazy stories have been told about Bob over the years, that he's running a meth lab, that he's got a string of hookers down in South America, that he's dead. Once a year, somebody comes up with a story that Bob is dead. It's no wonder that he's tried to leave all this stuff behind him and wants nothing more to do with it. It took me a long time to coax him into doing this interview earlier this year to recognize the 25th anniversary. I'm hoping to talk him into going on Coast to Coast, maybe in November. But I wanted to sort of share with you a couple of the pieces, the stuff that he is comfortable talking about, and that is the technology, the science involved. As I mentioned at the beginning, he claims that these craft operate on an anti-gravity sort of mechanism. Let's play that clip where he talks in detail about.
That alone is something amazing. Look, that can change everything we know today. Just having a machine to produce artificial gravity. Because look at what that does. We know gravity, space, and time are all tied together. There are your shields, like on Star Trek, that deflect micrometeorites. There is your protection from radiation without heavy shielding. There is something that, with an intense enough focused field, you can actually bend space. And there is something that can actually alter the flow of time. I mean, that's the missing piece of pie.
Didn't they actually freeze a
candle?
A flame freeze?
Yeah, now that's when it was connected to the gravity amplifiers where they could focus it, and
They froze a candle?
Yeah, they had a candle lit to set it up for you. Again, there's a large, in the craft itself, there are 3 long pipes. I'd say, I don't know about, what's that, 3-4 feet in diameter, maybe 5 feet long. Anyway, they dangle, the 3 of them, at the bottom of the craft. These produce gravitational waves, and they can focus them to a point or spread them apart.
Those are what you call the wave guides?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They're part of the power source control mechanism and the wave. Well, the waveguide is what I actually call the interlink between them, but that's the gravitational engine. They had one of those devices out along with the subsystem that connects it, so they can produce the power from the reactor. It runs the gravity amplifier, and they can focus and change the gravity beam that comes out of it. They were, speaking of Barry, took a candle, put it close to the mouth of it, lit it, a normal flickering candle flame, and then activated the reactor. The gravity wave came out as expected, and the candle flame remained luminous and stopped moving. And
Which defies physics.
yeah, because
The
look, if it's going to freeze it, the photons should stop being emitted. If it's going to, change the characteristics. Look, how can the combustion continue to take place without the convection inside the flame? Because actually, the reason a flame is elongated is not really because of heat, it's because of gravity. Because gravity pulls down and, convection moves flames upward. It's why in a zero gravity environment, flame is a ball. Obviously, there's nothing to pull things around. But anyway, if you negate the gravity around it, why is it still pointy? How can it still be making light? And why doesn't it move? Well, heat, from what Barry said, it's not just gravity, but it's also time locked. You've distorted
froze a frame of time.
Yeah, they essentially froze a piece of time there. And what do you say? It's empirical evidence. You're looking at it. It's not
You can see it.
It doesn't make sense that you could see it. And look, the stuff I saw there was the most unbelievable, literally, because it defied what we knew as physics. And at least I thought it did. And maybe what we knew was a little incorrect and just needed viewing from a different angle.
We do know now that research into anti-gravity is at the top of the list of what American tech companies are doing and Defense Department folks are doing, and anti-gravity propulsion is something they want very badly. Bob said that the key to it was this element 115. He had a piece of it. I saw it. In fact, he had a little experiment they did with what's called a cloud chamber, where it looked to me like light. They had a piece of this 115 in this chamber. They put some smoke in it, and then had a beam of light through it, and the light bent. Bob, at one point, when he thought he was going to die, had this piece of 115 it was in a lead casing, in a disc-shaped casing, and he had it in front of a particle accelerator at his house, and he had the accelerator on, and all he had to do was flip a button. If this stuff was real, as he described it, flipping that button would hit it with, I don't know, it's protons, electrons, whatever it was, that would make it explode, an annihilation that would have left a great big hole in Las Vegas. Now, he had that piece. I saw the experiment. What happened to it, that's a story for another time. It's in a spot now where nobody could get to it, but it's still there. One of these days, maybe after Bob's gone, I'll go dig it up. As at the time that he told us the story about element 115 did not exist. It does exist now. It's been synthesized. They've made it in a lab. It only lasts for microseconds, but it is real. They've confirmed that it's now on the element chart. And in this piece, Bob talks about 115.
They finally did synthesize element 115 that had the properties that I stated.
But it wasn't stable.
Yeah, it wasn't stable. Now, each element has isotopes. For instance, let's talk about hydrogen. We're all familiar with hydrogen. Hydrogen has 3 isotopes. They're all hydrogen. There's hydrogen, protium, be the technical name, deuterium, and tritium. Well, tritium is a radioactive hydrogen. Deuterium is another stable isotope of hydrogen, and regular protium, ordinary hydrogen, is the hydrogen we all know. They're all hydrogen. They have different amounts of neutrons in them. They all have 1 proton, which makes them hydrogen. Now, this is true for all elements. You can have the amount of protons in them determines what element it is. So element 115 has 115 protons in it. It's element 115. Now, depending on the number of neutrons it has, it will still be element 115, but it can be any number of isotopes of it. We've synthesized 115, we made one isotope, we have a radioactive one. Now they just need to continue on working with it. I mean, they made just a few atoms, but we'll see what other isotopes they come up with. One of them, or more, is going to be stable, and it will have the exact properties that I said.
Or could we make it? Or does it have to be natural? As you speculated about that
Well,
before.
it's natural. It'd be difficult to find it. To get some usable material, I do not think you can make that synthetically. It's just, it takes too much time. I mean, to make, an ounce of it or even a gram would take a tremendous amount of time, because not all the interactions are successful. I mean, you can bang particles together all day long and one may get stuck, and then you've got an atom, and how do you contain, this single atom?
So how do we get 500 pounds of it? Where'd that come from?
Well, it had to either be synthesized by the extraterrestrials that bought it in the first place, or, maybe there was a location where they came from where, look, this was a naturally occurring material. We know that all the material in the universe, essentially all the atoms of all elements, came from hydrogen. I mean, all you really need is just atoms of hydrogen to make anything. Once they start collecting together large quantities of them, gravity just begins to push them together under their own weight.
So it's sort of like a Rorschach test. Aha, they made 115. He was right. It really does exist. Somebody who doesn't want to believe it says 115 doesn't behave anything like Bob Lazar said. It's sitting around in a pile of 500 pounds or something, right? I mean, it's sort of like that.
What is the...
Right. You have to, you just have to start accumulating, whether you believe it or not, and I personally, again, I prefer you don't believe it. Just begin accumulating the facts that you can verify, and really be careful where you get the facts from, because if you see documents obtained by someone that they say are official, I've seen the most ridiculous things on the internet. Here's a report from some government agency going, yeah, everything Bob Lazar said is fabricated, and we've verified it with the main office in Philadelphia. And I mean, just nonsense stuff. Verify it yourself. And if you start adding up all the facts, look, the people that were with me at the time, have an obvious advantage, because they knew me before all this stuff happened. They knew at the time I didn't even believe in flying saucers or life from other planets. I mean, to me, those were just crazy people that bought into these stories.
Coming to the end here. I guess you'd say, could you really keep a secret like that? Wouldn't it leak out? Well, it has leaked out. It's whether or not you pay attention to it or not that matters. One of the guys, if there's anybody who would know about this being true, it's a guy named Ben Rich, who was the head of Skunk Works, which was the Lockheed company that built all the Blackest projects, the SR-71, the U-2, Stealth, all of that. Ben Rich, who headed up Skunk Works for such a long time, if anyone in the civilian sector would know, it would be him. So I asked him about it. On the day that they unveiled the stealth fighter at Nellis Air Force Base, they had it sitting on a tarmac, and they invited the media to come in, and I was one of the guys that was there that day. And so Ben Rich was available for interviews, and I went up and asked him, Mr. Rich, great to meet you. I asked him a couple of questions and then led up to this one. A lot of people say there's alien technology and stuff that you developed. And he stops for a second, looks at me, and he kind of laughs. Nope, just good old American know-how. But before he died, Ben Rich said this in a public comment, and the reason I'm asking is friends of his had asked about UFOs, and he said it was real. But he said this to an engineering audience. He said, we already have the means to travel among the stars, but these technologies are locked up in black projects, and it would take an act of God to ever get them out to benefit humanity. Anything you can imagine, we already know how to do it. We have the technology to take ET home. It won't take someone's lifetime to do it. We have that capability now to travel to the stars. He died a few months after that, but he was trying to tell the world something. This stuff is real, that what Bob has said is real. I'll end with one last little piece of Bob, because people wonder what goes on in his life. There's all those rumors I told you about before, and I put him the question to him in a couple of different ways about whether he would do it again. And he goes back and forth. Basically, I think he would say no, but here's what he told me back in May.
But that drives him crazy. I mean,
That's
you need
fine.
to answer this. Now, I need an answer. How many times do you get that in a week still after all this time?
I get, there isn't a day I don't get emails. And, I try and get this across to them. Look, I don't even want to talk about it anymore. Well, I don't believe the story. Great, pass it around. I really don't want you to, because it makes life difficult for me. I'm trying to do serious research. I've got contract with governments and other companies for R&D work, and aside from, other scientific interests, and I want this divorced. Look, if I went and did everything I can to prove my story and reached a tipping point for where people like Stanton Friedman and, people along those lines said, you know what, this is beginning to look factual. Do you know how that would annihilate me? That would destroy my business. It would make it impossible for me to operate. And, I'd have a continuous flow of questions, annoying people, I'm sure offers to do things that I am not the least bit interested in.
There's got to be part of you somewhere in there, even though it would be counterproductive. There's got to be part of you that wishes, God damn it.
Okay, I'm going to end it there. It's about to end on its own. That presentation is really a good one, I think, although he's kind of a funny speaker. But I do believe what he says is accurate, and what he talks about with Bob Lazar is true. And I am interested enough in this topic, especially around Lazar, to continue with more next week. We're going to do an interview with Art Bell, who is from Coast to Coast Radio, and he'll be interviewing Bob Lazar. It'll just be Lazar speaking, and he'll get more into the whole technical aspects of what he worked with. Okay, I got to get out of here, and I wish you a great day, and always embrace the mystery, and embrace the mystery that is you. See you next week.